Yeah. First of all, thank you, Robert, for taking the time just to talk to
My pleasure.
the group, but also me specifically, because, I was a journalist before I was a practitioner in the technology arts, and I started my career at Macworld magazine. And so for me, I wrote about some of the stuff that you were living. So I'm excited to talk about the actual things that happen. And as a journalist, you always want to find the real stories, not the stories that Wikipedia or even your book will tell me. So I'm going to be looking for some questions that maybe go a little deeper. And I'm going to start off with some questions about your background, because I want to know who you are.
I will feel free to not answer.
That's it. That's fair too. That's hopefully nothing is going to be controversial in that sense. Maybe I want to start off by asking, your background. You told me that you think of yourself as an engineer, not a computer scientist. How do you describe yourself? Did you start off as an engineer when you went to school?
Well, at school, you mean which level?
That's a good question. I'm gonna leave that up to you to decide.
I think I always had a sort of a curiosity about how things work, and taking things apart and not always putting them back together. And so I come into some context, and I will see a problem and try to fix it, or at least imagine how to fix it. And I think that was there from always, and therefore also the reason why I chose to go into engineering. I always hesitated about what exactly to do and left as many options open as possible. But I studied engineering, a 5-year bloody hard curriculum at the University of Ghent. We had 36 hours of courses a week, plus an exam, because we had this very nice, actually, in retrospect, regime whereby every subject had 3 preliminary tests and then a final exam. And so we always knew where we stood, which meant that most of us after the first year also finished, which was, the bad ones had been eliminated.
It was a trial by fire, essentially.
It was a trial by fire, but it happened the first year.
Yeah.
And so after that, you had to work very hard, but you were going to get there. And so I graduated in '69, and then I wanted to start a PhD on, of all things, the optimal number of blades in a fan. Not these small fans, but the really big ones that will, say, ventilate the Empire State Building or something like that. Big, huge machines. And I needed for that a lot of data, because if you want,
and you need a PhD to do that for a fan. That seems like an important.
It was flow of compressible fluids.
All right.
Is not something for which in '69 there was enough computing power to do anything. You had to do it experimentally. But let's not go into the details of that. The net result was that I needed a lot more data than any of the predecessors had gathered. And I ended up with a lot more data, which then I needed to sort of compute with. Therefore, meaning I needed a computer. Now, the university had one computer. This was '69, remember? And nobody really knew how to do this, because what I needed was a database, but nobody knew the word database. Yeah. So I started looking into computing, and then decided that I needed to study computing before doing that. And then I got into computing, and I never left computing.
Well, that actually brings me one of the next questions I had for you, which is what was your first computer, and not the one in the university. That's what was your first computer? What was your first personal computer?
A ZX80.
A ZX80.
But that lasted one night, I think.
Well, you broke it. You took it apart, didn't you?
No!
You took it apart, didn't you?
No, you couldn't take that apart. It was about this big. No, but it was certainly not something that I was going to use, because remember, by that time, by that time I was already fully into computing and doing it on a professional basis.
So
and
you had
therefore
personal
I did
computers
not,
and
I
and
did
work
not want
computers.
to come home and have to do more programming. I wanted a machine that had a nice human interface. And in fact, I've always been working in human-machine interfaces, if you consider that aspect of all the stuff that I've done in the past. And so I wanted a machine that I didn't have to program again. So I tried several of them, but it always came down to the same thing. These things were made for enthusiasts and hobbyists.
Yep.
And you couldn't do much with them. And then there was something called an IBM PC, which was, I'll tell you an anecdote after I finish this. And then I knew about raster graphics and the graphical user interface, but you couldn't buy that. And then, so having tried all these other things, finally I ordered in January '84, I ordered a Mac, never having seen one, and knowing that it would only arrive, the first copies would only arrive in France in June. But I knew that that was the thing that I was not, that I was going to be able to use and not having to program myself. Right, and so that was
your first personal computer. So you're in a
that
world
was the one that I kept.
Yeah, that was the one that was your
that was
computer.
the one
as
that I
opposed
was
to the one you
usable.
worked with. Yeah. I'm going to jump ahead to CERN a little bit now because you've now set the stage of the 1980s, and we were in a time where PCs, personal computers, and work computers are kind of existing side by side, but it's still quite a new thing, right? I mean, in the 80s, the idea of having a personal computer, the famous "why would anyone need a personal computer" is a great anecdote, but tell me a little bit about the culture that you came into at CERN. What was the culture at CERN like in the 80s and 90s?
Well, I came in the 70s, right? Yeah. So I began in the 70s. I came in December 74, and just after my military service, where I had also used computers in war games, simulation of NATO war games of all things.
We're going to come back to play and computers in a moment.
Okay. Well, it was more serious play that, but and so I came actually for the renovation project of the computer controls, so human-machine interface again, the computer controls of the proton synchrotron, which was CERN's oldest. It was CERN's oldest accelerator and the first alternate gradient accelerator in the world. And it is still today the machine that delivers all the particles that go into the other machinery, including the Large Hadron Collider. But at the time, at the beginning of the 70s, they had something like 100 meters of racks with oscilloscopes and dials and knobs and God knows what. And it was very difficult to maintain and difficult to add to and change and so forth. So they thought the Holy Grail was a total computerization of that thing. It turned out not to be, but that's a different story.
But there's a jump here, right? We're going from being an engineer of problems and using computers to solve specific things. You, at some point, make a shift to start talking about computers as ways to distribute information and information design. Yeah, but
I was never really in information design. No. But so that control system taught me a lot about, again, the human-machine interface and how that should be and how things should be easy, and for the history. When we had finally made a design of this new system, there was a lot of software to be written, and but that was one-off effort of writing software. So the decision was then taken to hire a number of contract programmers, and contacted the British company that sent out contract programmers to do custom software. and Tim Berners-Lee was among those. And so I met him for that effort. This was 78, I think. 78, 79, if my memory is correct. He was there for 6 months, and he used a lot of the software that I had written. Among others, a markup language, although I don't know how that influenced HTML, but that's another story. Anyway, we sometimes had coffee together, but we didn't really work closely because he was on a different part of the system. Yeah. But I knew him from then, and then I changed for my sins and did office computing, because I had written this very advanced, for the time, text processing system on which Norsk Data built its fortune, because it came out of CERN, so it was free for any of the member states. And they became very rich about that.
Using your software. Well, you're bringing up something really interesting to me, because before there was the World Wide Web, there was hypertext. And, and the concept of hypertext, so Ted Nelson, hypermedia, you were clearly aware of this. You were working in hypertext before the web.
Yeah.
So, and you said earlier this morning that the innovation that Tim brought was the URL, which was but tell me a little bit about hypertext. Why did CERN need hypertext in your mind?
Well, okay.
Sorry, this is a big jump.
No, this is an important point, because why did CERN need hypertext? CERN never, or anybody at CERN ever expressed the need for hypertext, right? And people would come around and say, look, we need to increase the number of protons in the bunches from 10 to the 13 to 10 to the 14. Those were needs that were recognized and people discussed, but nobody ever discussed the need for hypertext. It was sort of an observation, again, as I said, from the engineering point of view. You go in there and you see a problem, and you see these guys exchanging documents and doing it by writing them on diskettes, when in fact the place was already completely networked for the printers. So why not use the network to send the documents from one machine to another? And I had already, of course, used things like HyperCard and those things. So I knew about hypertext, and I knew about those features. And so I thought, well, that is something we need to study and see if we can use this. But it was, let's say, it was I who recognized that this could help.
Well, so we're talking about a networked environment already, because networks had existed for a while. Scientists were communicating this way. We had protocols. We had Gopher. We had FTP. We had Waze. We had all kinds of things. But what was it about hypertext? It strikes me that it's a very democratic way of approaching things.
Hold on. The internet came to CERN only in &88.
Okay.
Right.
But you were still networked as a group.
Oh, yeah. We had our own networks. We had built something called CERNnet, which a term which you can no longer use because it refers to the China network. But yes, and there were different ones. And then, of course, industry had its own things. There was DECnet, and IBM had the networks, and everybody tried to do something. So there was a lot of networking going on, but there was no uniform standard. And that's where the internet sort of bulldozed through.
So we've got a lot of things happening at this point, at my time I'm pointing. So a lot of things come into line. And it does strike me that the democratic idea of hypertext is very different than everything else. The idea that you would link computers to each other and you would start to connect resources. And if you think about what we've got now with TikTok and the feeds and the algorithms deliberately try to keep you on their system. And this was about getting you off of another system and going someplace else.
Okay, there's two things here. One is the idea of linking things over the network. That came much later, and in fact, when Tim and I submitted a paper to the Hypertext conference, it was refused on the grounds that there was nothing new and nothing interesting in doing this thing over a network. Right? Yeah. But we were allowed to have a poster session, but not the paper. Paper was refused. That's one thing. And the other is that anything like these social media, I do not consider them part of the World Wide Web. They
Agreed.
are big blobs that sit there and that you access using that protocol and using that browser maybe.
Yeah.
And even there, they prefer you to have their app and therefore
They want to lock
completely
you down. Absolutely,
bypass the web as such and just use the internet protocols. Right.
Yeah.
So I don't consider those part.
No, and I agree with you. My point really here is that at the time, the idea of trying to link scientific people together and sharing information, hugely important to the community already. It was already an existing idea. But the idea that started to reach out to the general public, and this is where I connected to it, because I'm in California, I'm working for a magazine, and all of a sudden magazines and people now have control. They have the ability to use these tools, which for the longest time were the military's tools and scientists' tools.
No, leave the military out.
The internet,
military were no.
The internet
no,
and
no,
well, DARPANet. How do you in America? They were very much military tools.
No. The money came from there. You might as well say that if you use a mouse, that the mouse was a military tool because it was built with a grant from ARPA.
Yeah.
But I mean, they followed. I don't know whether it was Eisenhower's idea or his scientific advisor, but the idea with ARPA was, and DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project, the idea was to sow wide and then pick those things that might be militarily useful.
Fair enough.
So,
civilian control of the networks was important to Eisenhower, for sure. And the technology.
Well, the technology was important. The civilian or defense control, that would have been separate anyway. Yeah. But the idea was just to say we give everybody who wants to be innovative, we give them money, and if we can use it, so much the better. It was all triggered by Sputnik.
Yeah.
That was the real origin.
That caused us to spend the money that we did on the technology.
That caused the panic. You know, the Soviets have the high ground. This can no longer happen. We have to stimulate anybody who thinks they can have an idea. We'll give them some money and hope that we can use it.
At what point, and we're back to CERN for a second, and the shift from being a CERN tool to becoming something that you decided needed to be in the hands of a different consortium, and it needed to leave CERN.
Yeah,
Tell me a little bit about how that came about, because that strikes me as something that you were really heavily involved with.
Well, yes and no. So, first the internet comes to CERN. That was 1988, and that was Ben Siegel. And I think that's a wholly different topic about whether that was good or bad. And then my proposal of studying this network stuff came at the same time of Tim's proposal, but I wasn't aware of that. And so when I did become aware of that, a whole interesting anecdotal story.
The book is very good on that topic. It's really quite good.
Yes, and so... we then got together, and of course I knew Tim from before, and I hadn't really realized that he'd come back. And then it sort of slowly began to grow, but to me there were two things that were important. One, this wasn't physics. So there was no way that in the long term CERN was going to devote money, resources, people, offices to something that, one, was never a project, and there was no official project description of it. It was just two geeks in a corner, writing something on the next computer. Second, so it was not physics. And second, it sort of needed some sort of protection out there. So I spent 6 months with the legal service in 92, end of 92, beginning of 93. Remember, it was still not possible to get a connection to the internet if you were not an academic or a research institute. And I spent 6 months with the legal service drafting a paper that the directors would sign that put the CERN's web technology into the public domain, different from royalty-free, in the public domain. And then that document, which is a page and a half, and you can search for it and find it, that document was signed by Walter Hoogland and Helmut Weber, who were the directors of technology and the director of administration at the time. Of course, I didn't sign it. I mean, who was I? Fortunately. And then when that was done, so that was April 93, when that was done, we were still worried because it was clear that there were some movements, not so much in Europe, although there was one, Opera, but that as a company that came later. But there were some motions in the US and a little bit in Europe to write servers and browsers and editing systems that could be sold commercially.
And this is when I start to becoming aware of it. I'm in California. I'm in San Francisco, and Macworld is one of the places you can get a lot of these tools. And we start hearing about there might be a server. And one of my bosses says to me, I think we should, as soon as there was server software available, we started thinking.
But what year was that?
This was 94. This was 94. So one of my point is it goes very fast. All of a sudden, this is now loose to the world in a very interesting way. And you've now got people like me who are plugging in a Spark workstation under my desk and plugging an internet and trying to figure out what I'm going to use to.
It was actually very slow. It spread very slow.
Oh, but at the time it felt very fast, right? All of a sudden I was talking to the magazine and they said we can plug this in. Yeah. And I got a copy of Mosaic to review for the magazine, and I'm writing a review of this.
Mosaic, the big flattener.
Yeah. The big flattener. Tell me what you mean by the big flattener.
Yeah, well, okay, but let me first answer the first question. So we were still worried, and there was Mosaic, and so we thought we have to protect this better, and the only way to protect this better is by making sure that everybody sticks to the same standard, because the web is not really a technology, it's a standard. So let us try to get all these commercial and non-commercial players around the same table, have a consortium of all these people so that they meet and they decide commonly on the same standard, which Netscape was not very keen on, of course. That came out of Mosaic. And then Mosaic, the Great Flattener, yes, because unfortunately, Mosaic was a program, a browser that existed in executable form for all the platforms. You just went to the NCSA server and downloaded that, and there you had a browser. And it worked on all the platforms in the same way. But it was only a browser. It was a single window, single page browser. There was no way to edit. It was just, you had to do all that by hand. Whereas the next one was everything in one package. And so we lost a lot. Well, we lost all of the editing functionality, and it became then reserved to the insiders to make the servers, because you sat probably behind a Mosaic or Netscape.
We actually ended up having to figure out how we were going to write HTML and a lot of different reasons to do that, and we needed some people to figure out how to do that and take the magazine and turn it into to print.
Exactly. And with the next browser, you would not have had to do that. You would have seen your article. You would say, "Oh, there's a mistake there."
Let's adjust it.
Clicked on it and adjusted it, and Mosaic just
flattened that. Well, it made, and this is
just ignored it. They just ignored the whole thing.
It made it a consumption device and not a two-way communication tool.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's really one of the biggest trends that leads us to the social media eventually. But I want to shift gears a little bit now and ask you about Something you said this morning, I'm going to be a little mean for a second. You called the artists in the room, and you were saying wishy-washy emotional ideas, I think was the exact phrase. And I know a bunch of people in this room bristled for a second just when you said that.
It was provocative.
I know you were
provocative
for that. So I'm gonna bring this back. I'm gonna say a quote from one of my heroes, Charles Eames, who says that toys are not as innocent as they look. Toys and games are preludes to serious ideas.
Oh yeah.
And my question for you is, what is the role of play in innovation and research? What is the role of the artist in science?
Well, I don't know what to say about that. I have collaborated with artists at
and you're doing it right now, just to be clear.
Inside. Yeah, no, sure. At CERN, and we have one going on right now, but I'm not involved in it anymore because I've been retired for a while. But the role of play is extremely important. I think the reason that there are so many important spin-offs from CERN technologies, and there's 2 volumes full of that. One volume dedicated exclusively to medical implications of CERN, work done at CERN. The reason why there is so much side effect, if I can call it that way, of what we do at CERN is that there is no stress about the bottom line at the end of the month.
Yeah. Well, you and Tim got to go be geeks in a corner and make something quite fun in some ways.
Well, yeah, but it was just because Mike Sindel found out that maybe this was a more or less realistic exercise to test out the next as a software development, the next system as a software development system in view of the LHC needs that were going to come up. You realize that we knew that the LHC data handling would require computing power beyond anything that existed at the time the LHC was conceived. And the IT division extrapolated on the basis of Moore's law, which is not a law. It's just an observation. Extrapolated that, well, yes, we're going to build it because by the time it's operational, the technology will have sufficiently advanced and the problems will be solved. Now, that was a great risk.
It was a great risk, but it was also some of the first things that were on the internet. And I remember, because we had to write about something in the magazine, I'm like, what's on the web? Right? It was not that exciting to write about particle physics in Macworld. No one's going to do that. So what did I write about first? I wrote about the Trojan coffee pot.
Oh, the famous coffee pot.
Yeah, so it was in Cambridge. It was in the Cambridge Computer Lab, and it started before the web. The first camera was on the network, but it wasn't on the web. It was one of the first things that went on the web that was an image and not text.
And I remember an even more horrifying thing.
Yeah,
because that was the coffee pot. You could look at it.
That's all you could do.
Yeah. Yes.
You knew, but you could do if coffee was available, which seems important.
Yeah, but you could look at it. But it was only looking at it. But then somebody at CERN, some experiment, I'm not sure it was Aleph, it was probably Opal, but I'm not. Yeah. They put up a web page in which there was a form field in which you could set the currents in the magnets and control and this was not protected in any which way. You could just blow up the experiment if you want.
Yeah, if you wanted to, yeah.
So
security in the web, early web, was maybe not the strongest.
No, but it was only available to academics anyway. So
there was only about 5,000 people who worked on it at that point,
in 93?
Later.
No, 92. Yeah. On my birthday, I trampled to the snow in Tampere University in Finland to find a student whom they would send on their resources to deal with the problem of security on the web that nobody else wanted to tackle. Because
we still don't really want to tackle security on the internet as well as we should, right? It's still one of the biggest problems. And
but that's because of the bad choice of the TCP/IP protocol.
Yeah. We're about to get super geeky, and I want to take us in a direction I think you started indicating in your talk this morning that I think is important here. In 1985, Neil Postman wrote a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
I didn't read it.
He argued in this book that we didn't need to worry about the totalitarian future of 1984 and Orwell. What we really needed to worry about was Huxley saw. Huxley in Brand New World said, we're going to deaden ourselves with entertainment. And I want to ask you about the web a little bit as what it's become, because when it started was a very serious in some ways, but the growth of the web happened around the same time as we started getting 24-hour news channels, which was in 1991. Fox News comes around in 1996. So we start to be in a world of just assault by too much information. And entertainment in some ways becomes more important. Half the internet traffic today is video. Half of that traffic is bots and automation.
Yes.
Does it make you sad sometimes that the thing that you made is now become very trivial?
No, it's. I mean, these things are again lumped up in big servers that I do not consider part of the web. I mean, YouTube is a part of the web. No, it's not. It's not. It's as little part of the web as say WhatsApp or Facebook or any of the or X or any of these things. They are big blobs that are sitting there and competing, but they are not the web. I mean, the web to me is the places where you can go to sites of companies explaining what they're doing and what they have to offer and not. Sites of schools and universities and the Wikipedia and that is the web. The rest is just big commercial blobs that use the TCP IP protocol and the browser interface, but
it's not the web.
No, not for me.
And not for me either. One thing you did when you left CERN was to focus on the Web for Schools project. Can you tell me a little bit about how that became a thing for you, and why that was? Why was that after the web for you, or why after CERN's version?
Well, it was something that must have come up at one point for several different parallel reasons. It was because of the people I got to know at the European Commission at the time, and the fact that my stepdaughters were at the Collège International in the Lycée International in Ferney-Voltaire, which was founded by CERN staff to have a place where they could send their kids and where they could get some education in their own culture and language. And they were there, and I thought, well, the schools should have access to that. I mean, they had computers, but no internet connection. So I sort of made sure that they had some line, but it wasn't good enough. And then I mentioned this in Brussels, and then they said, we have some funds lying at the bottom of a drawer. Maybe we can do a Web for Schools thing. And so, I became very enthusiastic about that and invited 150 different secondary schools all over the European Union to take part in that project. That is to train teachers. The computers were already there, but to train teachers and giving them internet access and getting them up and running. And I contacted a few schools that I knew myself, one in Austria, for example, that I happened to be on ski holiday. Stuff like that. I think that was, it was a drop in the ocean, really.
But it does seem to be a natural extension of what your life has been about, Robert. When you look at what you've done and what you wanted to do, it makes sense to me that you didn't really care very much about the way the internet is going, but you did care about how people were going to use these tools to help educate each other.
Yes. It's more important that you teach people how to use it than what is on there, because that is going to be there anyway.
Yeah. So these are tools, I think, for me, one of the things that was exciting about the internet when I first got started, it was a democratizing force. The idea that you could use the internet to publish and reach the world was incredibly idealistic. I mean, we talked about this earlier, idealism. You said you're a grumpy old man, but I really think that's not true. I think you're a very idealistic man who sometimes gets a little grumpy about things, but maybe.
I mean, it made you laugh, didn't it?
Yes,
So,
it did.
well, that
And
is
I
good.
was going to challenge you on that. I could do this all night, and I'm afraid that would not be the right thing to do for anyone who's sitting here this time. But thank you so much for taking the time to maybe peel back some of the mystery of the web for us a little bit. And Michaela, how are we doing on time? Are we?
Yeah, I think you're bang on actually now.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. And again, I think I'm looking forward to seeing other people, getting a chance to see this conversation with someone who I have a ton of respect for. And thank you so much for talking to us.
It was my pleasure. Okay.